All right, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your indulgence. We're just a few minutes late, but thank you for coming to this special session on the groundwater governance challenges, opportunities, and best practices. This is organized by the International Association for Water Law in conjunction with UNESCO IHP, the Groundwater Project, International Association of Hydrogeologists, and the IHE, Delft Institute for Water Education. My name is Gabriel Eckstein. I'm a professor of law at Texas A&M University. I'm also the chair of the Executive Council of the International Association for Water Law, which is hosting this event. Welcome to the session. We have an excellent panel for you all. The purpose of this panel in this session is to look at the governance, the regulation, the management approaches, methodology of how to regulate groundwater resources at the national level. What we're trying to do is get a sense of how are countries dealing with these issues, and maybe even come up with what I would call good practices, not best practices, because I don't know if we know what best practices are yet, but what are good practices? And that's the point of this session. And I'll talk more later about good practices and best practices towards the end. But for now, I'd like to begin by introducing our opening keynote, Professor Joseph W. De La Pena, who has been a law professor for more than 50 years, most recently at Villanova, where he retired after many years, but he decided it's not enough, so he's continuing now as a visiting professor of law at Peking University School of Transnational Law in Shenzhen, here in China. In addition to having an extensive repertoire of publications, he is also has really phenomenal experience having worked with the International Law Association and served as the rapporteur of the Water Resources Committee of the Association from 1997 until 2004. And during that time, he was also one of the principal authors, or the author, of what is known as the International Law Association Berlin Rules. Further, he was director of the Model Water Code Project of the American Society of Civil Engineers, he has a JD, a Juris Doctor degree from Detroit College of Law, and LLM, which is a Master's in Law in Public International and Comparative Law from George Washington, and that wasn't enough. He got another Master's from Columbia University, another Master's in Law. So, Professor De La Pena, thank you for joining us, and I will turn over the floor to you.
Okay. Can you hear me properly? Yeah, okay. I'm going to run through this fairly quickly. I don't normally put up one of those slides that say A, B, C, D. That's what I want to do. I just go ahead and do it. But basically, I'm going to provide a typology, if you will, of different systems of water law that apply to groundwater. And I'll start with an opening comment that, curiously enough, it is still true in most countries that they apply different law to surface water sources and to groundwater sources. Makes no sense that they do, but they do. And I'm focusing obviously on the groundwater side. Now, let's see. How do I move this forward? Oh, there we go. You're all probably familiar with this. You have an original water table. You have typically some small water users sink wells for their personal use, maybe a small farm, etc. And those wells sometimes are hundreds of years old. And then along comes a big water user. It might be a factory, it might be a city. It might just be an industrial farm who sinks a very deep well and pumps out a lot of water, creates a zone of depression, and the next thing you know, the traditional long-established wells are dry. They're not deep enough to reach the new water table. And that, of course, gives rise, in a lawyer's mind anyway, to a legal question. You see, did those traditional well owners have a legal right to continue use of their well, and if they did, then what are the remedies? And that's the sort of thing that lawyers are talking about all the time. And as I said, I'm sure you're all familiar with this process, and you've probably even seen it in action. Let's see, move forward, okay. Now this is one of my favorite photos. It's actually, it comes from a webpage called duckboy.com. They sell, among other things, postcards. And this is an actual postcard with the actual description, a conversation about water. And this is what happens when you don't have lawyers. Okay? This is how you solve water disputes. I throw that out because I think many of you are not law trained, and some of you at least have heard this many times over the years, wonder what good are your lawyers, you know, they're just getting away. Well, they prevent this, you see, if they're involved. Now, groundwater law is different from surface water. We've been using groundwater for thousands of years. We've been using surface water for thousands of years. But for surface water, you can see where the water comes from. You can see where the water goes after it passes the point where you take it out. You know what the effects are to a large extent. Until very recently, none of that was known about groundwater. All we knew is you put a hole in the ground and sometimes you got water. And in many countries, including Europe and North America, but many other countries as well, the way they found that groundwater is what they call dowsing. A man or a woman who supposedly had the touch would walk around with a stick, and when the stick suddenly pointed down, they'd say, drill your well here. And that was the extent of so-called scientific knowledge. There was a near complete lack of knowledge about groundwater, where it came from, where it went, if you put a well in, what the effect would be. And this is summarized in a case called Fraser versus Brown in Ohio in 1861, in which the court described groundwater as secret, occult, concealed. I love that word occult, magic, you see. It's just a simple way of summarizing it. We knew nothing about it. And so how is a court supposed to decide who has a right and whose right has been invaded if they have no relevant information? And you can find similar expressions from courts throughout the world in the 19th century. And not so long ago, some of us, well, none of us were born in the 19th century, but some of us were born not too long after the 19th century, okay? And the result was the court simply said, we can't give a remedy here. Now, unfortunately, at least in some parts of the world, they described that refusal or, deferral on giving a remedy as saying, well, the landowner owns the water and nothing we can do about it. But what they're really expressing is this lack of knowledge. We cannot give a remedy if we don't know any information relevant to the case. And so this is often described as absolute ownership or absolute dominion. If you own the land, you own the water under it absolutely, meaning no one else can tell you whether to drill a well or what to do when you drill a well. But again, it's better to think of that as lack of knowledge than it is to think of it as a legal right. But it was often expressed as a legal right. And in some places like Texas, they refer to this as the rule of capture. Groundwater is yours if you can capture it, which is, drill a well, pump it out, you've captured it. Again, this can lead to very bad results. Now, in the 20th century, we've seen lots and lots, well, actually began as early as the 18th century, but they really took off in the 20th century. Technical and scientific developments that allowed much greater information. The very first major change was the development of deep mines that penetrated, where the mine itself penetrated the water table. And the problem was not to use the groundwater, but to get rid of it. And you began with the newcomer's pump in the early 18th century in England, and it was perfected by Watt, James Watt's steam pump that was patented in 1776. Now, it was not really a well. I mean, it would run a pipe out from deep in the mine, but the pump would allow them to dewater the well, get rid of the groundwater. And so the early legal cases you find, at least in Europe and North America were about dewatering rather than about competing uses. Can I get rid of this water? And in the process of getting rid of the water, dry up my neighbor's well. 1937, the next big breakthrough, which occurred in Nebraska in the United States, was the development of high-pressure turbine pumps, which allowed you to pump water from much deeper wells up to the surface and put it to use. It was invented for the purpose of providing irrigation water on farms, quickly used for cities, factories, all kinds of uses, and beginning around 1950, quickly spread all over the world. Well, I could go into the sociology of Indian farming and how this impacted that, but I don't really have the time, because it had a huge impact in India and many other parts of the world. But there was no legal restraint, because the law said there is no law, if you will, about groundwater. Do whatever you want. So a lot of people lost their land, lost their property, lost their livelihood, lost their ability to feed their families because their wells dried up and they could not afford to install their own high-pressure pump. This, however, created a need for information. And there have been steady improvements in our ability to gather information about groundwater ever since 1950. But it takes time and it's expensive. So again, the small landowner operating a small farm is not going to be able to do the research necessary to prove his or her claim, or its claim. The result of all of this is there have emerged, now I've tried to put these in more general terms. You'll see I put in parentheses the US law equivalent of the more general term. But I'm trying to put it in more general terms because it's not just something that happens in the United States. It's really something that happens around the world, one or another of these types. And some countries or some United States, this is state law, so some states of the United States will take bits and pieces of this type, pure type, if you will, of water law and mix it together with bits and pieces of another type. But these are the basic types. First thing, and this is quite common around the world, if you can prove it's an underground stream, and people used to think lots of groundwater was underground streams. Today we think actually rather little of it is. But you can prove it's an underground stream, they typically apply the same law to it that they would apply to surface water, any stream. But once you move beyond that, you get a very big differences and often no correlation at all between the law of surface waters and the law of groundwater. And this is, 75 years after this, the pumps, those turbine pumps began to impact on the use of groundwater, and we still haven't come to grips with the reality that groundwater and surface water have to be integrated in your management, which means they have to be integrated in law. We still haven't come to grips with that. Now, the groundwater law for surface water is, by comparison to groundwater, relatively simple. You see, I'm not going to take the time to go into it. It can be complex if you combine bits and pieces, ask anyone from California, but it's, relatively simple. And the three models you find on the surface are riparian integrity. This is what they call the natural flow theory in the United States. Riparian sharing. Riparian land means land that abuts the surface water source. Riparian landowners are, in some views, are entitled to maintain the integrity of the source, which really means you can't make much of any use at all unless you're the lowest one down. Riparian sharing, the reasonable use theory, temporal priority, first in time, first in right. Very popular in some parts of the world, but not in others. Now, and public management, or what I call regulated riparianism, is catching on in the United States and in other places. That's surface water. There are 5 approaches to groundwater, and some of these approaches are used in combination. The one that harks back to the days of ignorance And it's still found in some parts of the world. It's still the law in India, it's still the law in Texas, it's still the law in some other states. Absolute dominion, or the rule of capture. Do whatever you want. Kill your neighbors, that's up to you. No limit. Second is proportionate sharing, what in groundwater terms we call correlative rights. Now this works when the competing interests about using water relate to are related to the size of or the area of the land being serviced by the well, so that you can share in proportion to how much land you own. Obviously benefits the big landowner, but it doesn't cut out the small landowner completely. Secondly is reasonable sharing, or the reasonable use rule. Now somebody has to decide what's a reasonable share for each landowner. And again, it can be expensive and time consuming to get the relevant data so that you can know how much water should be allowed to be withdrawn, and then looking at the competing uses, what's a reasonable share for this user. In the United States and other common law countries, that is done by a judge who often knows next to nothing about water. So it's not necessarily the wisest approach, but it seems to be the fairest. Temporal priority is used in some parts of the world. First in time, first in right. If you've been pumping, so you go back to that original slide about those traditional farmers, they've been pumping a certain amount for hundreds perhaps of years. They're entitled to keep pumping that amount, and if someone wants to interfere with that, they've got to compensate them in some way. And finally, what I call public management. Again, I use the term regulated riparianism. I'm using public management. I recognize some of you will say that, well, groundwater belongs to the state. That's if it's actively managed by the state, that's public management. But I want to recognize that it's not always done at the state level. Sometimes it's communities that own the water. But it's still a public management process. And so those are the basic types. Now I can go on. Perhaps I shouldn't take too much time on the specifics of these. They can get the details. Matter of fact, maybe I should just stop there. What do you think? Because I'm basically going to I have some slides on the specifics of each of these, but I think perhaps time would be better spent making room for the other speakers in the panel discussion, okay?
I think that'd be lovely.
Okay.
Thank you.
Oh, I should add, even though you own it, that doesn't rule out entirely the possibility of regulation. That's a related matter.
I don't know if this is on. No?
It's just like my classroom.
Thank you. All right, thank you so much for that sort of setting up the landscape here. And I think we're going to hit a lot on this in terms of who gets to manage, who gets to regulate, who gets to control, who gets to own the resources. And I've got a panel here around me which has fantastic experience with these issues and a variety of backgrounds. So I want to first give a quick introduction to the panel. On my far right, your left, we have Lily Yu, who's a professor-level senior engineer and deputy division chief in the General Institute of Water Resources and Hydropower Planning and Design at the Ministry of Water Resources in China. Next to me, here, we have Eric Garner, who is with the law firm of Best and Krieger. Thank you. I didn't put it in there. I don't know why. But he's been a practicing attorney for more than 35 years. On my left, we have Dinesh Kumar, who's the executive director of the Institute for Resource Analysis and Policy in Hyderabad, which is an Indian think tank on water management that he founded in 2008. And of course, we have Professor Joe Della Penna. And what I think you will see here, that we have two lawyers in Professor Della Penna and Eric Garner, and then we have and PhD engineer, PhD in water management. So we're gonna have a diverse set of perspectives here on these issues. And so what I'd like to do is to start off actually with Lily, from an engineering and management point of view. You heard at the very end Professor Della Penna talk about the idea of that government might be regulating or managing or owning, and I don't know, those are three different things, right? But is the government in the best position, from your perspective, from your experience, is it in the best position to manage groundwater resources?
Well, thank you very much. Firstly, I would like to say thank you. Thanks, Gabriel, for organizing this session, because this is really a very valuable opportunity for me to discuss this issue with lawyers and engineers from other countries. Very valuable opportunity. Well, for this question about the role of government in groundwater resource management, I would like to say the government is very necessary to play an important role in groundwater management. Because groundwater management is related to many aspects of the social society. It's not only about groundwater, it is related to the whole water sector, it is related to agriculture, the land use, and also industry, many aspects. So it needs the government to do some coordination work or even take a leading role. And also, not only government, I think the market or private sector's involvement are also very important, because groundwater is everywhere. And normally when we do groundwater management or governance, we are dealing with these issues with many individual farmers or small-scale users. So it cannot all controlled by the government, and it needs some other parties to be involved in. So I hope I answered your question.
No, that's perfect, thank you. And that kind of leads in, Dinesh, I want to ask you, I mean, Lily mentioned the government, but you also mentioned the private sector. And I'm wondering, what's your perspective on the role of government versus the role of private sector in managing, in administering, which is can be a different thing, right? Because it's in regulate. I mean, can the private sector regulate, or is it only the government that can regulate groundwater?
Thank you so much, Professor Degree. My thinking on this is like this: that it's a complex resource. Government has a very big role. Even today, government plays a very big role when it comes to resource assessment, resource evaluation, and even what you call framing regulations. It's a different matter that in countries like India, regulations are not effective for regulating, checking groundwater or exploitation. There is a big role that government will have to play in governing the resource and even managing the resource. But then the role of the private sector comes at the macro level. The government, the institutions, the broader institutions we need to support micro level initiatives. The local, it will be private. When I say private, I'm referring to the farmers. In a country like India, we have 25 million wells, and there are many more farmers who want the groundwater. So there are tiny water users. So they have a role to play when it comes to even enforcing regulations. The government wants to frame a regulation which is socially viable and politically not very sensitive, but then implementing that, enforcing those regulations, you have the private farmers, the individual farmers who appropriate the groundwater to do it. Otherwise, it's going to be extremely difficult proposition, given the large number of tiny water users. And then even to frame regulations comes to governance. We need to involve the people at that level, at the farmers at that level, because it's a question of livelihood. We're talking about 25 million wells means So every farmer, every small farmer is dependent on that well for livelihoods. It's not about commercial farming. Of course, there is a lot of commercial farming, but then we need to involve the small water users, small marginal farmers, to even frame regulations that are sensible. Today, what is happening is that there are top-down regulations being framed, but then very difficult to implement at the local level because they are not implementable, simply implementable.
All right, thank you. So they're difficult to implement at that local level. What are some of the challenges? Why is it difficult to implement? And so I'll confess, I also happen to be a lawyer, so I think from a legal perspective, and I think, something must be wrong with the law or the implementation of the law. And I wonder, Eric, from a legal perspective, what are the challenges that you see in terms of implementing some kind of regulatory regime at the top level? I don't know if that's a national level or is it regional, or maybe down at the local level.
Well, that's a complex question. Thank you all for being here, by the way. It's a great honor to be here. Well, I think the challenge from the legal perspective is that the regulations, the laws have to apply in the real world and in the real groundwater basin, and every local condition is different. So you can have a great legal structure and it may not work well in the particular hydrologic situation that you're dealing with. I mean, that's from the legal perspective. The practical perspective is the one that was alluded to here, is if you can somehow pass a law that the private sector is not happy with, and that's pretty unlikely in a lot of places, or the elected officials aren't going to stay in office long if that happens. If you can even get it passed, it's that problem with implementing it at the local level. There has to be stakeholder buy-in. The pumpers have to buy in. Now that said, they can't regulate themselves, or we wouldn't be sitting here having this discussion. So it has to be a combination. But I think that the real legal challenge is in the real world. Water moves. It's a difficult resource. Professor Delaplana talked about how we can't see groundwater. The science is better, but it's not nearly what it needs to be. It's going to keep evolving and changing. So there has to be that flexibility, and there has to be the real world application.
Thank you. One of the things that kind of jumps at me from a legal point of view in terms of coming up with regulations, when you develop regulations, you typically want to figure out who's responsible, right? And that relates to, at least I think it relates to some kind of either ownership or responsibility regime. And I'm wondering, Joe, if you have any thoughts on it?
Well, I'm going to come back to implementation, because this is, of course, the key step, and it's often very difficult. Even in the United States, where we are a very legal-minded society, we take law seriously. In some parts of the world, they don't take law so seriously. It's very hard to reform water law in general and groundwater law in particular. You run up against a lot of farmers, for example, say, "You're taking my water away from me." And you have to be very patient and explain over and over again, you are at risk. You have your well, and you want to do whatever you want with it, but somebody can come along with this bigger pump and a deeper well, and you're gone, unless you can afford to compete directly. And it takes a long time to get that idea through. And I think that's true in other parts of the world. The farmers think you're trying to take their water away from them, when in fact, what you might be doing is providing legal protection for their water. They focus on the idea that some other farmer who's downstream, so to speak, relative to the groundwater, is going to sue them because they're interfering downstream. And it's very hard to get them to think about, but you're not at the top. There's someone upstream who can interfere with you. So the real problem, well, twofold. One, gathering the necessary data, and two, educating people to understand the interconnectedness. There's still a widespread belief that the water underneath my land is always underneath my land, when of course it's moving. It's moving more slowly than the surface water, but it's moving. And the interference goes can come in either direction. And so you've got a big educational problem. And I'm sure this is true in other countries as well. They educate the farmers to realize. And the major political resistance that I've encountered, at least, has been from farmers. It hasn't been so much from factory owners or cities. I mean, the people they employ understand these facts. The farmers often don't. And we're not talking about ignorant people. We're just saying they don't understand this particular feature of their rights.
But so something that you said kind of caught my attention. That is, you said the farmers are going to buy water, which suggests an ownership.
Yes.
Right, and then you described a different ownership regime. Is ownership getting in the way of creating regulations and creating management? Is there a perception that that the person owns the water, or is the lack of an understanding that the government owns it, or somebody else owns it?
Well, as I said, when I talk about public ownership or public management, at the one extreme, and this is the law in many countries, but not all countries today, the groundwater belongs to the state. In other parts of the world, you have this concept of it belongs to the farmer, and the farmer might think they have a proprietary right, even if technically it belongs to the state, if the state is not actively managing the water. And then beyond that, and some of you know the name of Eleanor Ostrom, who talked about collective management, cooperative management, however you want to call it. I mean, this really is talking at the community level. And often that, as long as the community is in a good enough position to actually protect its members from other communities taking water, the community level may be the best level for active public management. And that's relatively easy. Again, it depends on the society and how individualistic the culture of the society is. But in many societies, people see themselves as members of the community and are willing to cooperate in the community to achieve optimum results. So it really depends on cultural factors. It depends on hydrologic factors. It depends on one part of the culture, of course, is the legal culture, and whether that's taken seriously, and if it is one thing, if it's not taken seriously, you get a totally different result.
Thank you. So let me maybe keep going with this kind of thread, because we've got two of the most populous countries in the world sort of represented here on this panel, and if I understand correctly, they have a completely different legal and ownership system for groundwater, right? In China, it's all federal or government. In India, it's a landowner. Common land. Okay. So from your perspective, I mean, how is ownership a factor in the existence of regulations, the ability to enforce regulations, and are they effective in relation to that ownership regime? Lily, you want to?
Well, in China, groundwater or water resources belong to the nation, belong to the state. Well, in 2021, December of 2021, we just issued a national law. It is called Groundwater Management Regulation. That is the first law at the national level, just specify on groundwater in China. Well, in this law, it is clearly stated that the local government is responsible for groundwater management and protection. And the national level will determine the criteria of groundwater management of each province, and then do the evaluation to check how the groundwater management will work for each province. And then the province level will do the same thing to the city or the county levels. And that is a way of, the groundwater is owned by the nation. Well, the management is done at different level. At national level, regional level, and local level, they have their own responsibilities. The highest level make the rules, and the province and local level just follow the rules and make sure their work is done in the right way. And the local government, not only the local water authority, the local government is responsible for the groundwater management in their administrative regions. If there's bad things happen to groundwater, like if the groundwater or voice partition problems is getting more serious, or the pollution problem is getting more serious, then the leaders of the government maybe have some need to pay responsibility. Yeah, that's how it's going to work in China.
Thank you. Dinesh?
I think the problem in our country, where you say that who wants the groundwater? A person who has land can access the groundwater underlying his or her land. So but at the same time, it is not the property rights regime in the groundwater case is not well defined. It's actually de facto. You can use the groundwater underlying a piece of land, but then how much you can use, how much you should, that is not defined. So there is definitely a possibility that you can restrict the state. If the state wants to come in between and restrict the use of groundwater, that is possible. But what is happening is, historically, if you look at the way regulations have been framed in the context of groundwater by various provinces in India, because it's a state subject in the country, so the provinces can make their own regulations. But then, if you look at read those regulations, they sound very silly if you read them, because 100-page regulation, an act, 100 pages, 98 pages are devoted to defining various terms. And then you say that groundwater will be regulated from so and so date, and that the date is not mentioned. So the date, it becomes an act, so you will put the date. But then the rules on the same regulation, how do you implement that regulation, and the rules and the instruments for enforcing those rules, they are never defined. So I think the devil lies in the details. I believe that if you really come up with a regulation which is sensible, the farmers will follow. You often say that there are millions of farmers, it's very difficult. Same time, there are also tiny farmers. They are not very politically so powerful, but there are few small fraction of the farming community who are very powerful, very rich. They try to lobby the governments, but by and large, the farming community, one which will actually follow those rules if the government is really committed to doing it. But somehow, every election, the government, what the party promises is free electricity. So free electricity means free water. So this is a tragedy. It's not that the farmers want to follow rules. Even in a country like India, we have seen it happening. But the government doesn't want to do it. They want to offer some freebies to the farmers. The best thing to do is to offer free electricity. So free electricity means free groundwater.
All right, thank you. Absolutely.
I think it's sort of a yes, but I think that ownership can get in the way, because if the government doesn't own the resource, then you absolutely will get people, farmers, whoever, saying you can't regulate me, it's my water. But even in the United States, where it's very clear that the government owns the water and that people get a use right to it, there are two other factors that operate. One is, and I typically represent cities and government agencies that deliver water, so usually I'm on the opposite side from farmers, just full disclosure there. But there are two aspects. I think one, that farmers, their lives depend on the water, really. Day in, day out, they're very closely connected to the water, because if it doesn't rain, they can't irrigate, there's no crop. People in cities, not as connected to the water for the most part. They turn on their tap, and if they're fortunate, water comes out. So farmers do develop, even though they know the state owns the water, sort of a proprietary feeling about water. And so there is a psychological issue there. But the second issue, the much bigger issue, is they're growing crops. They're making money, and everyone, even if they know more water is being pumped out than is going in, if there's massive overdraft, you see it in the Central Valley in California, you see it in the Ogallala Aquifer in the central part of the United States. Farmers know that they're pumping out way more water than is going in, but what's the choice? If they stop, there's a massive economic dislocation. So it's delay, it's hire lawyers to fight it because that's cheaper than the massive economic dislocation. So those are the other factors at play.
Okay, great. I want to move on to another topic. Before I do, I want to just alert the audience. We'll have a couple more questions here, but I'd like to also allow maybe 1 or 2 or 3 questions in a few minutes from the audience if you have any questions. So start thinking. What I'd like to just ask, if somebody on the panel would like to address this question. To what extent should the market be involved? I'm not sure. Should the Joe jumps up. Is
I actually had a slide on this.
is water a commodity? Should it be a commodity? Should the market be involved?
Yeah, I've made something of a name for myself as a market skeptic, so keep that in mind. There economists and some lawyers are great champions of let the market solve the problem, let the market be the great regulator, but they neglect the fact that if I am a farmer and I sell you the water from my well, I am going to be interfering, and you take more water than I've been taking. You see, you're pulling out water faster than I have. You're going to be affecting other landowners who did not sell their right to you. This is what we call the third party right. And in the United States, if you want to sell water, whether surface source or groundwater, if you cannot demonstrate that your sale will have no effect on other third parties, you cannot make the sale. And so relatively small amounts of water are being sold, except between very similar uses that are located close together. And because that kind of sale is not likely to impact third parties as much as if I want to take water out of a groundwater basin or a surface water basin, pump it 400 miles to some big city, that's going to have a huge impact on the other people in the basin who did not sell their rights. Whereas if I'm selling my right to pump water out of my well to another nearby farmer who's going to use it to irrigate her land pretty much the same way I used it, it's not likely to impact other users. And so the opportunities for markets to operate without heavy-handed government intervention are very limited. Now there's the World Bank, economists, lawyers who support markets like to point to Chile, which by the way just recently amended its constitution to severely curtail the Chilean water market. But a geographer at University of Arizona State named Carl Bauer did some extensive field work in Chile about how, because the Pinochet regime in 1980, I think it was, put in the Chilean constitution a very open-ended provision about markets. How did this work out in practice? And the answer is it didn't work out. There were almost no active markets in Chile, period. And even if the Constitution protected the right to settle, they didn't protect the people who would do the land work on the ground to carry off the sale from being attacked by the local farmers, and they often were. So it's just a myth that large-scale markets heavily transforming the way water is used have been successful. They haven't been in reality.
And yet there's still some markets in California, for example.
Yeah, and I agree with Professor Della Pena in the sense that I think at a large scale it's very difficult and they can't really occur without heavy-handed government regulation. And what has worked is if a groundwater basin is going to be managed and say a farmer was using 100 acre feet and the real right or the use right really should be 50 to protect the basin, to give them a right to transfer the 50 to another use, and they can probably sell it for more, and that mitigates their financial loss. So there are markets that do function on a limited basis in California, and they work well, and they have not had third-party impacts when they have protected the resource. But that has to be very tightly controlled and very heavily regulated.
Do you have any thoughts on this?
If you look at the Indian situation, we have a lot of this groundwater markets operating informally. They're informal water markets. So, like those farmers who have lots of resources, so they can deep tubers, they sell some of the water to their neighboring farmers. So there's a lot of trading of water happening within the agriculture sector, and there is some amount of trading happening between agriculture sector and the urban sector. Now, how you look at it is, if you restrict this access to water in volumetric terms, through proxies like energy rationing, etc., which is now tried in many countries, including China. So there is a scope for making this regularizing, making these water markets much more formal, which itself can become an instrument for ensuring equity and efficiency in water use. So when we look at these informal water markets, we find that groundwater use efficiency is much higher for the farmers who buy the groundwater. But then you have to have some kind of a control on this, because this is all happening in institutional vacuum. So anyone who has more resources can invest in a deep tube and sell water at a prohibitive price. But then that will stop once we have some kind of a regulation at the macro level regulation, and then those who have little surplus water will be able to sell it, including small and marginal farmers. And in fact, the big farmers are the ones who will be actually buying the water from the small and marginal farmers. So I look at it totally from a different perspective.
And I wonder that's maybe because it's unregulated. The
Now
ownership
it's
is-
unregulated, and it's
Yeah.
all controlled by the rich farmers.
Yeah.
So once you regulate this water access, groundwater access in volumetric terms, the terms of the trade, the way it works will change.
But is it tied to the fact that there's no regulation on ownership? I mean, it's just,
Yes. No, but the government can still do that
Okay.
using proxies like energy rationing.
Yeah.
Instead of trying to control the groundwater use, you try to control energy use, because government is still controlling the electricity supply, energy supply. So it can actually restrict using certain other, under the what you call energy sector reforms. It can restrict it. It's now restricting. There was a time when the farmers were not paying for the electricity. Now there are few states where the farmers are paying for electricity. They use for groundwater. So there are successful cases. So they can extend it to restrict the use of energy itself. Now, how much energy you can use for pumping groundwater using prepaid meters. So you don't have to get into the real challenge of controlling groundwater use, but you can control energy use, because that is a state again.
And I would imagine in a country like China where everything is owned and all the water resources are owned, markets would be either prohibited or really tightly controlled.
Well, thank you for asking me this question. Well, the answer is no. It is encouraged.
It is?
Yeah, it is encouraged. Because we have water permit issued for the water users. And if the water users, they have some extra water permit left, they can sell it. And now we are just trying to mobilize, encourage people to do this transfer water market. But to build this water market, we need, more accurate data about to support the management. Like in China, the land is operated in small scale. It's not like in United States. The farmers own big farm. Well, in China, the land is operated by individual families. So there are many wells. Even for a small county, the amount of wells may be 10,000. So it is not easy and maybe impossible to install metering equipment for all of the wells. So we don't know how the amount of water we use. And even we set the criteria, we set the targets. We say, okay, for this county you can use a certain amount of groundwater. but sometimes it is difficult to know how they actually use, so it is difficult to do the evaluation. So when we want to do the water transferring or the marketing, that is a problem we need to solve. And actually there are some successful examples in China. Some industries, if they have some actual water permit, they can sell to other industries, but it needs to be supervised by local water authority. And there are some certain rules, like in the groundwater over-exploitation region, it is strictly, there is a strict limitation to do the transfer. Because the groundwater is already exploited in that region. Groundwater use should be reduced. If the users have actual permit, then it should not sell to others. There's some limitation. And also, to look the groundwater as community, I think transfer is one aspect, and also the price. The pricing system is also, I think, reflect how we look at the resources. Like we are trying to improve the water price system, because currently most farmers do not need to pay the water fee for irrigation. They only pay for the electricity fee. And about more than 60% of groundwater is used for irrigation, so that is the cost for over-exploitation in some places. So we are trying to improve this pricing system to charge more money for the over-exploited region, and to encourage people to reduce groundwater use. And also, some places to hire a company to do the metering, and to do the metering and to do the charging, so they can get their profit from metering and charging the water use, because there are so many wells it cannot own done by the government.
It's interesting. I didn't expect that it would be that developed.
Yeah.
That's very interesting. So let me open up the floor. Is there anybody that has a particular question for one of the panelists or the whole panel? If there is, please raise your hand. And do we have a...
Thank you so much for the insightful discussions. My name is Oda Hanuma, and I'm from the Ministry of Water and Sanitation in South Africa. I like that the professor indicated and gave us a history of the groundwater law, especially water law, and how groundwater is still lagging, and more particularly in reference to surface water, and implementation being very difficult at local level, which is where the groundwater typically occurs. Now, how do we, he's also mentioned that they need to be, surface water and groundwater needs to be managed in an integrated manner. I still find it that the profile of groundwater among decision makers, especially maybe a water decision maker, is still low. And we typically have more dominant surface water people in the room who are making decisions on behalf of groundwater without interacting with people with a groundwater specialist background to make an informed decision. And one such a case is in South Africa, where in one part of the area we had a surface water drought, and the people in that room are predominantly surface water strong. And they put restrictions on both surface water and groundwater. So that poses a challenge in managing groundwater resources when there is potentially groundwater available that could be tapped into, but it's managed based on the lens of there isn't any surface water. So for restrictions are also placed on groundwater based on surface water. So how do we navigate that in an integrated way when we know we still have an abundance of surface water professionals in the room making those decisions?
Okay, great. Maybe one more question. Yes, Francesco?
Hello, Francesco Sindico, University of Strathclyde Law School in Glasgow. Question for all, including Gabriel, probably. It has been mentioned that when it comes to regulation, management, context is incredibly important. And that what works in one groundwater body may not work even in the one next door. If that is the case, how do we manage the challenge of comparing, if you want, different state regulations, management, countries, and considering that, how do we arrive, if that is what we want to do, to the definition of good practices, even best practices, as you mentioned?
Let's start with those, Joe.
Well, let's start with this question of the need for integrating or conjunctive management, if you will, joining the management, surface water, and groundwater. I'm going to tell you a little story. This took place in the state of Georgia in the United States. Beginning around 1989, Georgia entered into, as did the whole southeast of the United States, into a prolonged dry period, which is still going on. And it's gone on long enough that people are now asking themselves, is this really a drought or is this the new normal? The farmers at one particular river basin in the southwest corner of the state, it's called the Flint River, and the farmers reacted to this prolonged dry spell by simply putting hoses, if you will, into the Flint River, hooking up a pump and pumping water out of the river to irrigate their farms, so that by the year 2000, the Flint River was regularly pumped dry by the late summer. The Georgia legislature passed a law saying that they would pay farmers to stop pumping water out of the Flint River. And the farmers lined up to get paid. What the Georgia legislature forgot to do was put any regulations on groundwater withdrawals. And so the farmers took some of that money they were paid and drilled wells, sometimes as little as 3 meters away from the river. And the result was the farmers got a lot of money from the state, and the Flint River was still pumped dry. You have to realize that groundwater and surface water interact with each other, and sometimes quite quickly. And you cannot manage one without managing the other. You've got to, again, educate people if they don't. Those farmers knew what they were doing. There was no mistake there. But you can't do one without doing the other. So, I think that story better than any other illustrates the point. So that's as far. Now, as for the second question, I'm not so convinced that we can't draw lessons. You have to, one of the things you'll notice is that I put the types of groundwater law at a fairly general level, because the more specific you are in your description of the legal regime, the less transportable that legal regime becomes. But you can talk about general types. Now, I'm a great believer in public management, whether it's, if it can be done effectively at the national or state level, fine. But often, as I said, often it's really done more effectively at the community level rather than nationally or statewide. But I'm a great believer in that. I don't claim that I can prove absolutely that that's the best way, but it seems to me it works better than the alternatives. But, if I had taken the time to go through all those other slides, I would give you some reasons as to why that's so.
Anybody else want to maybe chime in on the issue of, which I think you were asking, how do you get the information across? How do you educate on things like groundwater? What is it? So it's not, as the professor said, the occult earlier. Anybody with experience here wants to I'll tell you what I do. I teach water law, and when I get to the groundwater section, actually I used to do it with the surface waters too. I would have the county water authority bring in they have a model river on a flatbed. They would, bring it behind a truck, and I would show them, how does a river work? In class, I bring a model aquifer, and we put water in, we put dye into, so you can see the cross section, right? You put dye in it, you can see how the water moves in the ground, and all of a sudden people's minds start going, oh, wait, I think I start to understand. I think it has to be that basic. I'm actually going into the legislature with a model aquifer. I would love to do that. I would love to do that because I agree. I don't think they understand. That's my experience. So, yeah.
If I could just touch on briefly how difficult it is, given where we are, to bring these together. Professor Delaplane told a story about Georgia. So the brief story about California is there's been surface water regulation by permit since 1914, over 100 years. To use surface water, you have to get a permit from the state. 2014, every 100 years, California passes a law about water. In 2014, they passed a law on groundwater to regulate groundwater, not requiring permits, but to regulate it. And they addressed the issue of surface groundwater interconnection in there. And that was in 2014. And what did the farmers insist be in there for that legislation to pass? That you can't consider it until 2025. So they know, and they know that they're damaging the surface water, and they wanted that lead in time. Now we'll see what happens in 2025.
Coming to the surface water groundwater interactions, I think the point is very valid, but we also need to understand the situation changes from location to location. There are areas where the interactions are quite pronounced or quite evident. Shallow groundwater areas where the water withdrawal can actually affect wetlands, things like that. And there are areas where the groundwater is so much dewatered, now that interaction no longer exists. So the best just shouldn't become the enemy of the good. So we should try with some of the measures, but then see how things change. There can be situations where the impacts can be quite severe or quite adverse. We are working on an ADB-funded project on canal rehabilitation. So we are all kind of very keen to get canals lined so that the water can reach the tail end. That was the assumption. But then we are interacting with some farmers in a village. A few women came and they said, sir, you are going to do the lining. Fine, what will happen to our wells? The drinking water wells. But this was a question which we are in fact raising when we started working on the project. But the project was already sanctioned by the ADB and the government wanted to do it. But as consultants, we are quite aware of the fact that all this, the seepage from the canal that is happening is replenishing the groundwater. So the women came forward and said that, sir, you can do the lining, fine. There are some farmers who are interested in, but then it is going to have a significant impact on our groundwater, drinking water wells. And we saw the same thing in another project funded by the ADB in another neighboring area. So these things are well understood by the people, but then there are lots of, there are conflicting interests, multiple interests in a situation.
Lily, did you have any?
So, first question about the surface water and groundwater conjunctival management and etiquette. Well, for the management, I think, we always say the groundwater should be, and surface water should be managed coordinatedly. Well, the main challenge is, even though they are highly closely connected, but they have their own unique characteristics, and normally they are managed by different people. Like in China, the groundwater, all the water resources management by the Ministry of Water Resources, but a lot of experts in hydrogeology is from the Ministry of Nature Resources. So that's why sometimes we are facing the challenges. Well, To give you a example for how we do the conjunctive measurement, I think there is one for a region. It's called the Xiliao River Basin. It is in the northwestern region in China, and in the mountain area, the groundwater wells are built along the riverside, in the river valleys. So the groundwater have been pumped out, and the surface water, the runoff has been affected, and even the rivers has been cut off. So normally when we do groundwater management, we set criteria to how much groundwater can be used for that region and what groundwater table should be maintained for that region. But for the Xiliao River, we also set another criteria is about runoff of the lower reach of the streams. So I think that is okay. So for surface water and groundwater conductive management. And for educator, actually we had a cooperation work with SDC, the Swiss Agency Development. We developed a game, card game, to let the farmers to play the games. By playing the games, the farmers can feel if they do not use the efficient way to irrigate their farm, they will have trouble. There will no groundwater or surface water by using game. And about this, can I also answer the second question? Okay. So about the second question is about what is good or best practices. I think this question is very good because normally we see some obvious effect of our work, but still there are challenges. I can give you an example. We are trying to solve the problems of groundwater over exploitation problems in the North China Plain, which has been over exploited groundwater for about 40 years, like Central Valley. Yeah, and you issued your act in 2014, and we issued our act we started our pilot work in 2014 and issued the action plan in 2019. And by using the transfer water to replace some groundwater use by using the efficient way to improve water use and put some land in fallow, many things we are doing, and we see obvious results. The groundwater level in some regions has been increased, but the question is, what is the ideal situation? Because in some places, especially in Beijing, the groundwater has risen up even it's similar to 20 years ago. So what is the ideal situation? Because the whole society, the whole city is different to 20 years ago. We cannot have groundwater everywhere back to 20 years ago. So what is the ideal station for groundwater? And on the other hand, what is the best regime to operate groundwater? Because currently the operation, the government needs to invest money every year and a lot of money. So how to make it sustainable? That is a challenge.
All right, and with that, I think we're going to have to, one last quick word.
Yeah, this last comment about rising water tables, that's a dimension we haven't talked about, but it needs to be considered because it is often a consequence of creating reservoirs on the surface that you end up greater seepage into the ground and therefore raising water tables. I went on a 2-week tour of Egypt in January of this year, and led by Zahi Kawasi, one of the leading archaeologists in Egypt. And one of the points he made over and over again is going into these underground tombs, is that they're being destroyed by the rising water table. You don't see water in the tombs, but the moisture is erasing the colors that are, in some cases, 3,000 and 4,000 years old, and the walls are beginning to crumble, and so on and so forth. That's just one dimension. When you raise the water table, you've got a whole, what farmers might discover that their land is waterlogged. They can't farm it now because there's too much water, and so on and so forth. So we do need integrated management again, or conjunctive management, goes both ways.
Right. Unfortunately, I'm going to have to call a close to this panel because we do have two other short segments, well, one short segment and then a closing keynote. So first, let me thank our panelists for participating. This was really fascinating. So thank you all. Thank you for participating. So let me do a quick short segment here on a project, just to let you know about a project that we're undertaking right now. As I mentioned, I'm with the International Association for Water Law, and the project that we're undertaking is a comparative groundwater regulatory study. We're looking at different nations and how they regulate their groundwater resources from very specific points. We're still developing the rubric. That's why I don't have any slides up, but we've started to develop the system for this study. We have already identified some of the topics that we're going to look at. We're going to take them topic by topic, meaning we may have one topic per year, and this will run for a number of years. And the first topic that we're dealing with is ownership. You heard a couple of discussions here about ownership. Who owns it? In what capacity? Is it the government, or is it government on behalf of the public, or is it the public? Is that something different from the government? Is it private? Is it no ownership? How does ownership affect groundwater regulation and administration of the resource? How does it affect conservation? How does it affect all aspects of groundwater? So that's the first topic. We're also going to get into issues of surface groundwater interaction. In terms of the groundwater regulation, we're going to get into water quality, which unfortunately we didn't have a chance to bring up on the panel, the groundwater quality and how different countries regulate it. We're going to get into the commodification. We heard a little bit about the market forces in different countries, and so this is a project that hopefully within the next 6 months to a year we'll start having outputs, work products from this. But if anybody's interested in contributing to this project, please let me know, because the International Association for Water Law is not just for lawyers. We have non-lawyers who are interested in governance, in regulations, administration, who are members of the association, and we do want input from diverse perspectives. We don't want just the lawyers involved in these kinds of projects. We want other people, economists, engineers, and so on. So if you're at all interested in this project and you want to contribute, I can tell you right now, we've started, I think, with 5 countries, and I hope to increase it to 10 for this ownership issue. Costa Rica, Argentina, Netherlands, South Africa, and Kenya, I think, are the first ones. I'm hoping to add another 4 or 5 other countries for this first topic of ownership, and then we'll see where it goes from there and how it develops. So just wanted to let you know about this project. But next on the agenda, we're going to have Mr. Abu Amani give some concluding remarks about what he's heard here, and also tell us a little bit about from what UNESCO is involved in. Mr. Amani is the director of the Divisions of Water Sciences and Secretary of the Intergovernmental Hydrological Program at UNESCO. He's held a number of different positions at UNESCO, Chief of the Executive Office of the Natural Science Sector, and before that as Chief of the Section on Hydrological Systems and Water Scarcity. He holds a PhD in Civil Engineering from Polytechnic of Montreal in Canada, and yes, we have the slides, the number 2. Yes? Is that the... Yeah. Okay, so... No? No, it's not that one. Closing. This This one? Yes, this one. All right, so thank you, Mr. Amani, for being here and providing your concluding remarks.
Thank you very much, Gabriela, for this opportunity and also for the very exciting and lovely session. Really, I learned a lot. I can summarize, listen to really the discussions on the fact that having the implementation of legal issues related to groundwater and also the issue of market, we need to understand. So I can summarize that we cannot manage something we cannot measure, we cannot understand. And also the issue of education come up so that everybody needs to understand how the system of groundwater works. And also the issue related to education. Within my presentation, I will want to add another layer which was not discussed here, is on the transboundary nature of the IWRA system. Because this is an element also, even though we are supposed to focus on the national aspect, I think this is another dimension we should need to consider. So what I put quickly is just this one. I think I can skip it. I don't need to convince you on the critical importance of groundwater, we all know. We talk about conjunctive water management. Indeed, we cannot separate the two. And if you look at the that publication we did together with key partners, the main issue is the issue of data and knowledge. Because you cannot enforce legal framework if you don't have the knowledge. Even putting in place appropriate and contextualized legal framework, we need to have that knowledge. And that is really what we are doing within our program at UNESCO. As you know, at UNESCO we have an older program called the Intergovernmental Habitational Program. We have been implementing since 1975. Currently, we are implementing the 9th phase of the program on science for a water secure in the changing environment. And I want to assure you that groundwater is embedded throughout the 5 priority areas of IHP9. Throughout the previous phases, also groundwater was part of it. Groundwater is part of it, first to knowledge, to improve the knowledge base. We need to know better groundwater, to make it visible, making the invisible visible. We need to educate all across. We need also to better manage water resources, and also we need to have appropriate knowledge for putting in place good legal framework for governance. Within UNESCO, as I said, we have been working on this issue of groundwater for many years. Here, I want to highlight the component related to the transboundary nature of the IWRA system. Unfortunately, we don't know all our transboundary IWRA systems. We need to continue working on that to identify them so that we can be able to provide support to government. So what are we doing? We are supporting government to better understand the transboundary water resources. That's the first thing we are doing. We are also supporting member states to have tools and methodologies in order to also better manage the water resources, and also we are building capacity. I will not go in details of all the different activities, but I want to highlight some of activity we have been implementing with other UN agencies and will be continuing. Is as you know, during the open ceremony we talk about SDGs. SDGs have indicators for monitoring, and we have one regarding transboundary water cooperation, the indicator 6.5.2. We have been implementing monitoring it with UNICEF. And within that framework, what we identify really is the lack of knowledge, even knowing the transboundary groundwater shared by countries, they don't know. For many countries, don't know yet. So here you have the different transboundary groundwater, currently 468, but look at the last point, knowledge about transboundary artifacts is still limited. and we cannot think about going from legal framework related to groundwater if really we cannot understand how the system works across countries sharing the same system. So this is something which is really critical we need to keep in mind. These here are some examples for which we were able to provide support to come out with some cooperative framework. Before that, as you know, within our program, International Shared Water Aquifer Management, we supported UN to come out with what we call the articles, as you know, the articles of transboundary water management. You know that you all know those articles, helping member states sharing the same water system to use those principles to better manage the water resources. So we have 3 examples. The first one is the template aquifer, which is shared between Botswana, Namibia, and South Africa, where really we want in depth to understand, to support countries to understand that system, and to come out with aquifer modeling. And at the end of the day, we're able to support the countries to have a coordination mechanism which was in place, and now is managed within the ORASCOM. The other example is also another big aquifer system, so the Gorani aquifer. Here also we have a project now going on in supporting those countries also to better manage the water resources. The last example I want to share with you is an example of conjunctive water management in promoting river-based organizations managing already rivers to integrate in their mandate the issue of groundwater. Because generally those river-based organizations, if you look at critical their mandates, the groundwater is not very clear. So this project helped to bring on all those issues of groundwater within the river basin of the West Africa. So the Niger, also the Senegal, the Volta basin, to have that element integrated within the basin. My last point is how to make the invisible visible. As you know, last year was the year of groundwater, and we organized in Paris the Groundwater Summit, for which we were able to bring some key messages which were presented during the UN 2020 conference. And the key message here is that we need to continue raising the profile of groundwater. And I'm happy to report that within the report of the UN 2020 conference, groundwater was visible. And it was clearly indicated that member states should invest in improving their knowledge of their groundwater, and particularly also their transboundary groundwater. And one also result is, as you know, also the transboundary water coalition, which was put in place. And there also we are pushing to have the component of transboundary groundwater considered. So it's just to give you an overview and to say that having proper legal national framework on groundwater should also consider the broader view of groundwater, which is also taking into account the transboundary aspect. So, by ending, I would say, let's continue the movement of making the invisible visible. It's by educating all those who are depending on groundwater that we can put in place and implement appropriate legal framework at national level and local level. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and I appreciate the opportunity to have you here. And maybe I'll just close on one note, because I think something that you said, and something I think some of the panelists alluded to, and maybe this would respond a little bit to Francesco's question on, we have different aquifers with different characteristics and different information, and some aquifers we have no information. I think the suggestion is that process is what we need. We need rules on process, not necessarily rules on who gets how much, because it may be different in different aquifers, but the process for data gathering, the process for collaboration, the process for coordination, the process for monitoring, process rules, I think is what I'm hearing from UNESCO, and I think UNESCO has been sort of in leadership on helping to develop this in different contexts, but also from the panelists, that if at least we can start from that point, later maybe we can figure out some of the differences, and are there rules that can be applied universally, or are they so different that every aquifer is different? Groundwater, water is a local issue, but I think groundwater is especially a local issue. So there's going to be differences, but I do think that with process, that's something that I think could at least help us get further along in terms of trying to figure out how do we govern these hidden resources. So with that, thank you very much to the panelists, to our two keynotes, and thank you all for the audience for being here.